The Leander-class cruisers were developed as a result of the naval treaty system in place during the interwar period. The Royal Navy faced something of a problem. The Washington Treaty had not capped cruisers by either specific numbers or total tonnage, but it had put a 10,000-ton displacement limit and 8-inch gun size restriction on them. This meant that the Royal Navy was able to determine the number of cruisers it needed, with the main limitation being cost, as it was assumed that Japan and the USA would build up to the maximum limits per ship with their cruisers. This led to the development of a two-tier cruiser plan that called for 70 hulls, calculated by the following method. Japan is the most likely enemy. Japan has 25 fleet cruisers. Japan can choose the time of war to maximise the number of ships she has available. Thus, the Royal Navy must be able to match those numbers but account for a number of ships being in refit or repair at the same time. Using a 25% figure for the number of ships that might be unavailable, this suggested that the Royal Navy needed 31 fleet cruisers. But the Royal Navy could not abandon its obligations elsewhere, especially for trade protection. Smaller cruisers and armed merchant raiders or armed merchant cruisers would still be an issue. And it was determined that a further 39 cruisers, as well as additional armed merchant cruisers, would be needed to secure global trade whilst the battle fleet did its work. This, therefore, called for a total of 70 vessels, and most of them would have to be new, as the majority of war-built Royal Navy cruisers were relatively short-range units that maximised offensive power for countering the high seas fleet. And in any case, few of these were anything close to the 10,000-ton displacement that the Royal Navy expected most of its likely cruiser opposition in a fleet battle to actually be. There were a number of reasons to go with a smaller hull for this design. It would allow more ships to be produced, and reports from fleet exercises indicated that the smaller C, D and E class cruisers were better able to deal with enemy destroyer attacks than the larger Hawkins class, and so a number of light cruiser designs in the 6,000-ton range were presented at the end of the 1920s. These had a variety of weapons options, including open single mounts and twin-powered turrets, with the main armament varying from 5.5-inch to 6-inch main guns. Due to quite a successful trial of a twin 6-inch mount aboard HMS Enterprise, the twin turret option was chosen, and in this particular setup the heavier 6-inch gun offered more advantages, including greater elevation, greater sustained rate of fire, more guns on the centreline, and better weatherproofing. Thus, it was decided to move ahead with a twin 6-inch turret option. The initial design that would become the Leanders was sketched with 8 6-inch guns in 4 twin turrets in superfiring pairs fore and aft on a 6,500-ton displacement. However, changes began almost immediately. The ship was slightly lengthened and the machinery spaces increased from 4 to 6 to improve survivability, with the boilers trunked together into a single funnel to make it harder to determine the ship's course and bearing. This and an increase in power output took displacement up to 7,000 tons. Further additions to armour, aircraft handling equipment, and even more power brought the displacement up to precisely 7,154 tons for the Leander, with the first ships actually ending up finishing a bit over this calculated weight at about 7,300 tons, although increasing expertise in welding would lead to this dropping down to just over 6,800 tons standard displacement towards the end of the production run. For this, as well as the main battery, you got 4 single 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, 3 quad 50 caliber machine guns, and 2 quad torpedo launchers, with 1 per side. Armour would eventually end up as 4 inches over the ship's vitals, with a 1-inch deck, reflecting the idea that the ships would likely be engaged in running battles with opponents armed with 6-inch or smaller weaponry, whilst the turrets only had 1-inch armour, which was basically splinterproof only. 72,000 shaft horsepower provided between 32 and 33 knots, depending on the ship in question. Whilst they cost about 75 to 80% as much as a county-class heavy cruiser, you could get almost 3 for the same tonnage as 2 of the larger ship, or you could get 7 for the displacement of 5 counties. For ships that needed to be in many places, This was a good thing, made even better by the advent of the London Naval Treaty shortly thereafter, which did restrict cruiser numbers and tonnage. The UK was allowed 15 heavy cruisers and 192,200 tons of light cruisers. Now, if all of these were 10,000-ton ships, that would leave the Royal Navy with a total of 34 vessels. This was enough to fight Japan, but only if they used armed merchant cruisers for every single trade protection duty under the sun. If light cruiser displacement was made up using Leanders, that would allow for another 7 hulls on the same displacement for a total of 41. This was still nowhere near enough, based on the Royal Navy's calculations for 70, but it was better than nothing. In part, this particular limitation would drive the development of the Arethusa class, which was an even smaller version targeted at commerce protection, but for the Leanders this would lead to 8 ships being constructed in the early 1930s: Leander, Orion, Neptune, Ajax, Achilles, Amphion, Apollo and Phaeton, of which the last 3 were slightly longer as the machinery rooms were redistributed to increase survivability, yet again, which led to the ships having 2 funnels instead of 1. The latter 3 ships would end up flying a different flag during World War II. Phaeton was purchased whilst under construction and would launch as HMAS Sydney. Apollo and Amphion would commission into the Royal Navy under those names, but would be sold in the late 1930s, again to Australia, as HMAS Perth and Hobart, respectively. All 8 ships would see intensive action during the war, with 3 of them being lost. Sydney and Perth would be lost in action, and Neptune would run into a mine. Due to the fact that the Royal Navy was nowhere near its target of 70 cruisers, these ships would end up seeing an awful lot of frontline action. Ajax, or Ajax, depending on which region of Greece you ask, and Achilles famously being 2/3 of the force that took on Graf Zeppelin. Sydney had great fun chasing Italians around the Mediterranean, whilst Orion and Neptune would appear in many action reports in the crucial couple of years in that same Mediterranean environment. The others, as well as some of the aforementioned ships, would largely see service in the Pacific in the latter part of the war, and of course all survivors would acquire more systems, especially anti-aircraft guns, as the war went on. Once the war was over, Leander, Orion and Ajax would be scrapped at the end of the 1940s, despite Chile wanting to actually buy Ajax. Achilles spent most of the war as a New Zealand ship, but would be back in the Royal Navy hands briefly before being sold on to India as the Delhi, where she would serve until the end of the 1970s. Hobart, the only Australian ship of the class to survive the war, served in a number of roles through the 1950s, but would be scrapped in 1962.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.